Welcome everybody. Welcome to this Regional Studies Association Early Career Plenary Panel, Regions in Recovery, Promoting Environmental Justice, Gender, Equality and Wellbeing. So Regions in Recovery is the second global e-festival organised by the Regional Studies Association together with a number of partners. And this is the second Early Career Plenary Panel. So this event has been running for several days now, and it's running till Friday, April the 1st. So if you are a non-presenting delegate, you could still register for free on the RSA website. So those of you in the audience, will you please keep muted at all times unless I ask you to speak. We hope that you'll put some comments in the chat and be willing to join in the dialogue with us after the presentations. So if you want to stay private and not be part of the recording, please keep your video turned off and do not unmute yourself to ask a question. To ask questions, please put them in the chat using a queue in front of it. You can also use the raise your hand function and wait to be called by me and then unmute and then you ask a question. So we're going to get started with the two speakers. These are both very interesting presentations and I'm looking forward to hearing them. Each speaker has 20 minutes. And the first speaker is Robert Bowen from Swansea University in the UK. So Dr. Robert Bowen is an international entrepreneurship academic in the School of Management at Swansea University. And he has previously held academic positions at Aberystwyth and University of Nantes in France. He's also holds a position of visiting professor for Audencia Business School in Nantes in France. Dr. Bowen undertakes research into rural enterprise, regional development, and SME internationalization. And he's published in a wide range of international journals and has presented his research at Welsh Parliament, House of Lords, and European Commission. So good impact there then, Robert. He currently holds position of co-chair of the Rural Enterprise Track at the annual ISBE, Institute of Small Business and Entrepreneurship Conference, and is editor of Regions, an online publication of Regional Studies Association. He's also a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So thank you with that build up. It's now time for you to speak. So 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for being able to speak this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me okay. And now see my slides. I'll just go back to the main slide. There we go. Okay, so yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm Robert Bowen, a lecturer in international entrepreneurship at Swansea University. Although I'm over the summer, I'll be moving to Cardiff University. So for the next academic year, I'll be moving along. My third Welsh institution. I'm not trying to do all of the Welsh institutions, but it's there's a pattern emerging there, it seems. My talk today is looking at regional development through well-being, and I'll be talking about some research that I've been doing in recent years with some colleagues of mine at Swansea University, who are Dr. Samantha Burville, Beth Cummings, and Leonie Themelidis. And so the focus that we have on well-being is sort of slightly newer or more recent in our research. And I come at it from a perspective as an entrepreneurship academic, not so much as an economist. So you know, this is maybe a new area for me in that respect, but yeah, certainly the focus that we have is looking at small businesses in this aspect. So the aim of the research that I'm presenting is to look at exploring well-being as a basis for regional development, particularly in the context of the post-COVID recovery. The initial research that we conducted was looking at a case study of an organisation that was looking at regional development in the Swansea Bay City region in the west of the UK. And from the research that we were doing, it emerged that well-being was a core aspect of what they focused on. And that also stems from the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that's in place in Wales. Now, well-being has sort of started to emerge more recently in sort of the academic literature and has emerged maybe as an idea in relation to regional development, although this is sort of still relatively new. And as a new area of research, it's particularly interesting to look at this in new research settings, new contexts, and particularly in the post-COVID recovery, given the nature of well-being and what it looks at, and particularly on the aspects of sustainability and maybe resilience within businesses, which are key aspects of well-being in a Welsh perspective, and how that might relate to small businesses who are coming out of the pandemic. So as I mentioned, the research will be based on part of the case study work that we did, looking at an organization called For the Region, which is a local organization that aims to bring lots of stakeholders together in sort of the local ecosystem and trying to promote regional development. And their work is underpinned strongly by the principles of well-being. So in terms of the literature, I'll speak briefly about regional development because the focus is more on well-being in this case. But the regional development literature sort of covers a wide range of issues and historically relates to economic growth, which obviously well-being then looks to sort of move away from in some respects. Obviously, we know that there's no one-size-fits-all type of approach when it comes to regional development, and this relates to the many different regional typologies that do exist. Such as the fragmented metropolitan old industrial area, peripheral regions, and obviously we see different policies happening in different places. The context of Swansea Bay looks at an area which is quite interesting because it includes the urban area around Swansea, historically known as Copperopolis because of its role in sort of copper production over many years, and particularly the Industrial Revolution, and particularly as an old industrial region. But it also includes then very sort of remote rural areas in Pembrokeshire and Carmarthenshire, which are very peripheral regions. So there's a combination of these different typologies, across the region. More recent literature has focused on more collaborative approaches, such as networks, clusters, entrepreneurial ecosystems, the triple helix model. And so this applies in relation to sort of the idea that we're looking at bringing together a range of stakeholders, but also things like smart specialization more recently, looking at boosting growth and jobs by sort of focusing on place-based aspects and competitive advantages. And this aligns well with the work of For the Region as the organization that we're looking at. And there's elements here of resource bricolage in the way that they're looking to use the particular resources that exist in the area and trying to make best use of those resources and the skills and sort of the stakeholders involved in the area to try and create opportunities for improving the regional situation. This also aligns with sort of UK policy of the last decade or so of looking to create a better balance across the UK economy, and more recently the term levelling up is being used. And since 2011, we've seen a growth of a number of city regions across the UK, of which Swansea Bay is one of those. When it comes to well-being, it's not a new term, well-being. It's something that has been discussed for many years by now, and something which gained maybe a lot of traction since the commissioning by Nicolas Sarkozy of a report looking at a way in which we can look to different measures for economic growth rather than maybe focusing on specific economic measures. But the authors of the report, Stiglitz and Fitoussi, looked in 2009 at ways in which we could look at well-being and particularly sustainability as a way of moving away from sort of the traditional economic drivers. And they sort of said that the time was right to start looking at other measures in this way. And indeed, when we look at the OECD's more recent definition of regional development, there's elements of well-being which come into this as well. I've included this at the top of the screen here. They talk about a general effort to enhance well-being and living standards in all region types, from cities to rural areas, and improve their contribution to national performance and more inclusive, resilient societies. Obviously, well-being is mentioned, but there's other elements of well-being there which are important, of maybe considering, an inclusive approach across cities and rural areas, but also resilience as well, which I'll come on to when we talk about the well-being in the Welsh context. So within the literature relating to regional development, so the links between well-being and regional development are sort of growing, although there's few links at present. Fudge is one of the key authors in this respect, looking at the intersection between the two and looking at the fact that they both have their roots in welfarism. Stiglitz, who obviously was part of the Sarkozy report, talks about well-being as maybe a more comprehensive understanding of human well-being aligned with traditional economic interpretations of the foundations of human welfare linked to that. Defining well-being then, Fudge talks about a state of being with others and the environment which arises when human needs are met, when individuals and communities can act meaningfully to pursue their goals, and when individuals and communities enjoy a satisfactory quality of life. And I've been discussing this a bit recently with some economists who I know, and they talk about the sort of subjectivity of well-being. And that's maybe an issue in many cases about how do we understand, how we can measure the impact of well-being in different ways, particularly when we talk about sort of satisfaction and qualities of life and things like this. So there are some maybe areas which need more research in terms of the well-being side. But we can also see that it links as well to ecosystems and something which is a key aspect of regional development. I wanted to show you some examples as well of sort of indicators for measuring well-being from different countries. Iceland and New Zealand are two countries which are recognized as using indicators for well-being. Here we have Iceland's indicators for measuring well-being, and you can see that there are 39 different indicators which sort of are mapped across different themes and society, economy, environment, and different areas within those. These do also include economic conditions such as GDP and economic growth, but they also then include other aspects such as life expectancy when we look at society, and even aspects relating to the environment and particularly towards sustainability. So things such as renewable energy consumption and recycling are obviously key aspects that we've been talking about now for some time. And obviously, since things like COP26 last year, there's been a stronger emphasis on sustainability and looking after the environment in the face of the climate crisis that we see. So a number of measures here that we see in Iceland relating to well-being. This is the New Zealand Living Standards Framework. And again, I won't go into too much detail on this because I'll focus on Wales in the context of my research. But I just wanted to show you the way in which well-being is sort of used in this way here in New Zealand. So these are based on sort of three core areas: our individual and collective well-being, our institutions and governance, and the wealth of Aotearoa New Zealand. These are also underpinned by aspects of distribution, resilience, productivity, and sustainability. So again, we do see sort of economic measures which are part of this, as well as other sort of more subjective measures that relate to quality of life and the way that society lives. But again, for the purpose of this research, we're focusing on the context of Wales, and therefore the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is what applies mostly into the case that we're looking at. And this is seen to be maybe a groundbreaking piece of legislation, and maybe one of the first in the world in terms of an actual piece of legislation that looks at well-being. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales is based on 7 core principles. These are a prosperous Wales, a resilient Wales, a healthier Wales, just going to move this slide, a more equal Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. In terms of the application of this act, it applies to the public sector at present, and many people have talked about the challenges that it faces in maybe trying to bring this act into the public sector, but at present it's limited just to the public sector. So these are the core principles that are the basis for the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and these are the core principles then that are the basis for the case study that we were looking at as well. So moving on to the research that we did. So the research that I did with my colleagues at Swansea is part of a HEFCU-funded research project that we were working on over the last 18 months. And the initial phase of this was to look at a case study for the region. So their approach that they were taking towards regional development and the influence of well-being that was underpinning that. This covers the Swansea Bay City region, and you can see the Swansea Bay City region presented in the sort of olive green colour that we see on the bottom left, sort of in the western parts of Wales here, covering Pembrokeshire, Carmarthenshire, Swansea, and Neath Port Talbot. Swansea and Neath Port Talbot are more sort of urban based, although there are parts of Swansea here that include the Gower Peninsula, an area of outstanding natural beauty. But Carmarthenshire and Pembrokeshire tend to be much more rural, and some quite remote areas, and areas which are not very well connected to Swansea as the main sort of core city here. The map also shows the city regions across Wales as a whole. In the bottom right corner, into the east of Wales, you have the Cardiff Capital Region, which covers 10 local authority areas across southeast Wales. In the north of Wales, you have the North Wales Growth Deal, where sort of Wrexham is maybe the largest town there, which is not necessarily an urban area. There's around, I guess, 50,000 or so people that live in Wrexham, and it's close to the English border. The further west you go, then it becomes quite remote. And the Mid Wales Growth Deal, which covers Ceredigion and Powys, which again could be quite questionable in terms of value as a city deal. Aberystwyth being the largest town there, a town of around 20 to 25,000 people, so not a very significant size. But our focus is on Swansea Bay in this case here. The methodology that we used in our research was to try and develop a comprehensive understanding of what For the Region was looking to do and the role in which it engaged with the members that it has. So we conducted in-depth interviews with both the directors of For the Region. We also did interviews with 10 representatives of member organizations, and we did a document analysis of For the Region's policies and practice based on documents that they've published on their websites, sort of podcasts, videos, and all the information that they make available about the organization. And we used a process of thematic analysis based on the Braun and Clark process in order to look at this. So just a word on the case study. For the Region, it's a membership organization of different regional businesses, community groups, and a variety of stakeholders engaging with local authorities, the city region, universities in the area, of which there's Swansea University and University of Wales Trinity St David's, and a range of different sort of small businesses, larger businesses, and community groups across the whole area. And this covers obviously the 4 administrative areas in Southwest Wales. So there are a large number of stakeholders. And the aim is to focus on asset-based growth across the city region. The aim is to try and engage with as many of the stakeholders as they can, bring them to a range of different events, which are sort of focused on different themes that they want to focus on. It could be looking at transport issues or procurement or the food and drink industry, and bring together stakeholders to discuss particular issues and then look for solutions to those issues, of which then they try to sort of take those ideas forward through collective cooperation and engagement then with obviously policymakers as well. Their mission statement here is that they say, we connect people, share good news, and enable collaboration through our forums, events, projects, and comms for a future that promotes the well-being of people and planet. So we see well-being at the heart of what they do. And they're very much sort of influenced by having a strong social purpose. So the key aspects are also shown on the bottom right of the slide here, in that they want to promote sort of buying regional, promoting development and investment in the local area, the circular economy, destination and transport, a well-being region, and a creative economy as well. So these aspects align with principles of well-being as we saw in the Future Generations Act in Wales. So moving on to the findings of the work that we did. Firstly, the directors' interviews, and we've included a number of quotes here, but I'll just pick out a few points just to sort of talk about those in more detail. Initially, what they spoke about as 2 directors of the company and 2 female directors who were entrepreneurs locally and were inspired to set up the organization because of frustrations in the way in which they saw opportunities in the local area. They described sort of the old paradigm of the way in which sort of we're having top-down approaches towards supporting regional development and not having a sense of empowerment or ownership amongst people who were involved in the process. They spoke a lot about sort of the old boys club of sort of people getting together and making decisions in that way. And they were looking very much to a new way of trying to do things. They spoke a lot about holistic flourishing, as they called it, a way in which they wanted to engage a lot of people together and seek opportunities to grow collectively. And focusing on entrepreneurship as 2 people who are entrepreneurs themselves at the heart, they wanted to engage in creating opportunities from within the area by looking at different problems and trying to solve the problems that they found. They spoke about sort of resources that they had, looking at the region and saying, we have everything we need here already. We shouldn't always be looking outside the region for solutions. So that's a nod towards sort of policies in Wales towards maybe foreign direct investment coming in and sort of creating jobs and the reliance on this in Wales, and trying to focus more on the opportunities that exist within. developing the ecosystem, sort of using the local resources that they have in place to help try and encourage the ecosystem to grow. But also they recognize that there are sort of challenges there, looking at the area as sort of an underdog region, given its sort of post-industrial heritage that it has, and also for some of the remote parts, then the sort of rural areas which have difficulties of their own. But they've really emphasized the ethos that they had in terms of collaboration, networks, ecosystems, and trying to develop resilience. And that's what they're trying to do, is develop the resilience of the region. And again, that's a core aspect of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. From the perspective then of the members, these are the findings of the members' interviews, and they spoke very positively about For the Region, particularly in the way in which they tried to give an opportunity for local businesses and local stakeholders to engage in conversations about what's happening. They, of course, had some critiques about not seeing opportunities for business to come out of the links that they've made with other people through the forums that they engage with, and also improvements in the way that they could improve their communication in what they're doing. But they focus a lot on the social purpose, speaking about supporting everybody to achieve an appropriate, positive, balanced economic, social, environmental, and cultural well-being, and focusing on the place-based aspects that For the Region we're trying to promote, and having a passion for the community. So they acknowledged that the focus on developing networks and creating this sort of ecosystem of a range of different stakeholders was valuable, that they recognized that the networks were already in place, but that people maybe needed to learn how to exploit those, make good use of the natural resources that were in place, and really focus on what For the Region we're trying to promote, which was asset-based community development. And again, this idea maybe of resource bricolage comes back in here, through making use of the key resources that exist in place and getting the most out of them. They did also recognize some of the challenges in terms of innovation. And for example, they spoke about the roles of the universities in the local area, but this was a way in which maybe people were getting educated, but the talent was leaving the area. So another key aspect was maybe retaining skills. And as a mainly rural area, this is always an issue that is seen.
Okay,
just a brief word.
Excuse me to interrupt. You've got about 3 minutes left. So
okay, thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Just a quick word on the secondary data. It was just a way of sort of confirming more about the approach that For the Region were taking, in terms of really highlighting the social purpose that they emphasize in their work. They have a series of podcasts and news documents and information on their websites that shows the engagement they have with government ministers, community groups, and focus on a range of different issues like the circular economy, local food networks, regional procurement, renewable energy. So this really confirmed the ethos that they had as a business in terms of their social, the purpose, and how it influenced the way in which they look to engage with a range of stakeholders. So trying to map out sort of what For the Region were looking to achieve in their work, we came up with this diagram here, in which we highlight that it's an organization which engages with local businesses, local authorities, the city region, community groups, educational institutions, individuals, all underpinned by the social purpose, which is at the heart of what For the Region wants to achieve. But it's also then outlined and influenced by the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act that exists in Wales, and the 7 principles that we saw. So these 7 principles were key aspects in sort of what the respondents were saying in terms of the work of For the Region, but also it highlights the role of For the Region is sort of looking to use these principles and trying to bring together the ecosystem across Southwest Wales, and focusing a lot more on sort of the cooperative approach that they have, engaging a range of stakeholders, and also them trying to be an enabler within the ecosystem. And there's wider debates about who should be sort of leading within an ecosystem, but the role of For the Region here sort of tries to enable opportunities for discussion and for highlighting specific issues to get people together to look for solutions to those issues. So the role of well-being within the work of For the Region, and particularly the emphasis on resilience, is an important aspect when we consider the post-COVID recovery, because I think we've seen from the challenges of COVID and the difficulties that many small businesses have had, and larger businesses as well to that extent, that greater resilience is something which is needed going forward, and whether that be a consideration of how businesses can collaborate more effectively on a local level, or whether businesses can diversify their business model. That's something which maybe businesses need to look at. So the principles of well-being could be useful in that respect, as well as also the focus on sustainability, because obviously as we're facing a climate crisis, this is something which needs to be taken into consideration in all decision making that's made in relation to businesses this way. So we see that the elements of well-being provides a valuable foundation for inclusive recovery for people in the area and for local businesses as well. That's the end of my presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and I welcome any questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Robert. That was excellent. Thank you. So there are questions in the chat. So Sally, would you like to ask your question, or would you like to do it at the end?
I think I can manage to ask it. Thank you, Helen. Nice to see you. Thanks for a great presentation, Robert. I really enjoyed it, and I really liked some of your the way you've laid out your slides. I suppose my question is about the scale of ambition. The document that the Welsh Government have adopted is quite ambitious. What is the scale of the finance behind it? Is there enough money going to support for the region in achieving those aims? And if not, how much more of an investment would it take, and where would you focus that investment?
Well, that's a good question. And I guess when it comes to funding, there's never enough money when it comes to these sorts of things. But the model that for the region have is that they're sort of independent from government funding, in that they're a membership organisation, and they have different levels of membership. Then they engage with local businesses who pay their membership fees depending on the type of engagement they have through different levels of membership, and they conduct their work that way. So I think they themselves will acknowledge that they're sort of fighting a difficult battle in trying to be heard and trying to gain sort of credibility in what they're trying to achieve. And they have discussions with government, with Welsh Government, for example, and engaging with governments are always very difficult as well, because they don't like to maybe see somebody come along and do something maybe that's they could be doing themselves potentially. So they themselves will acknowledge that financial support that they have is sort of based on their membership model. I guess they would like more funding in that way, but by being more in control of their situation and not so reliant on the government, I think then they have a clearer focus in what they're trying to achieve. And because it is about engaging different stakeholders within the community and them being closer to the community, I think they're better placed then to be able to manage that, rather than having sort of another level of bureaucracy on top of that through governance then.
Thank you. I think we need to move on. There's another very interesting question from John in the chat, but if we move on to Bardi and come back to you, Robert. Thank you. Okay,
thank you. So
I'd now like to introduce Bardi and Mashhoodi. He's from, and I shall get this wrong, Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. So we're back in the EU temporarily, which is very nice. He is Assistant Professor of Digital Landscapes and the Research Coordinator at the Landscape Architecture and Spatial Planning Group, the Department of Environmental Sciences in the University and Research, the WUR. His expertise is in geographic analysis and spatial statistics for regional and urban studies. In particular, he is specialized in environmental justice, household energy consumption, and energy poverty, spatial optimization of electric vehicles, infrastructure, urban heat islands, and mobility network analysis. That's quite a lot of stuff that you're doing at the moment. So we look forward to hearing your presentation. So you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the opportunity. Well, as Robert said, I'm also not an economist, but you will see, I'm more of a geographer. But it's very nice to be here. I share my screen, I hope. You see that. Yeah. Well, as introduced, I'm from Wageningen University. And this is a presentation about feminization of surface temperature. we are in the Department of Environmental Sciences, and we approach the environmental change from different perspectives. Among these perspectives is really change of climate and heat waves. We know all about and we feel the heat waves and how it works in the last summers around Europe. In 2003, it was about 17,000 casualties, if I'm not mistaken. 2019, the records were broken in many countries, many locations around Europe. In a location in France, it's got to 46 degrees, that historically unseen. It was historically unseen, this level of heat. And so that I think we are all convinced about that it's coming, and it's becoming more and more intense. There are many dimensions, of course, to these heat waves. And one of the dimensions very much is related to regional structure and the spatial structure of the places that we live. We all know about urban heat islands, the phenomena that some settlements warm up extremely. And also now it comes the question, who are the people living there? And is it really the same for all the people? Because people live on a different suburban rural areas, and who is more exposed to that? This type of question has been brought up by many institutions. For instance, UN Habitat in a regional guide about climate change comes with this definition of the climate justice. This is an exact quote from the document, which says the climate justice is a concept that climate change is not caused by all the population groups equally, and that its impacts affect different populations groups differently. Similar definitions exist in, for instance, European Environmental Agency documents. And so where it goes a lot, that talks about how to mitigate climate change, it's coming more and more the thoughts about who are the people who most affected by this. This was the initial point of this research, along other researches that we are conducting in Wageningen University, Department of Environmental Science. Here in particular in this research, the question was that is a certain gender group is over or underexposed to land surface temperature in the Netherlands? Does that overexposure has a special pattern? And could we find a special pattern in a country and regional scale? And would that this gender-based overexposure vary across different socioeconomic groups? Is it in addition to gender, age, ethnicity, income, or housing tenure of the gender groups affect their over or underexposure to land surface temperature? The study area was whole the country, just to start to see the variations around there, and then we can see if there's a regional or a spatial patterns in it. This is just a small overview of Netherlands. It's not really a big country. It's overall it's quite flat, as you can see on a left picture. Even the highest point are not really counted as a mountain or something. That's up to 60, 80 meters, and those are the highest points. So there's not a big differentiation in terms of climate caused by mountains or something as such. But there's a big differentiation in a right map, as you can see, on a land use. There's a dispersed urbanization, as you can see on for instance, northeast of the country, whereas more to the west and more to the sea, there's a more intense urbanization and the famous polycentric Randstad region that make a really big difference in a living condition in these areas. To answer to the question about land surface temperature, this is a very data-driven study. So The first thing was to analyze as much as satellite images that we could get to come with the estimation of the land surface temperature during summer. To do so, altogether 5 satellite images of different times per day are used. And each of these satellite images shows the surface temperature, average surface temperature of 8 days. And then you can start to see the pattern. There's a significant pattern in different hours in Netherlands that starting from beginning of the June to the end of September, there's an increase in the surface temperature, and that's and later on it's become flat again and comes down. You can see in a most extreme cases, which comes to the for instance at 1 p.m. In period 3, which is mid of July, the average surface temperature can be close to 30 degrees, which is really significantly high. And more important than that, there's a big variation, a spatial variation in this surface temperature. As I said, you know that the most urbanized area, the Randstad region, located to the west of the country, and here you can see that also is shown in a surface temperature map. The big cities of Amsterdam, Utrecht, Rotterdam really pop out on in the map, whereas more to the rural area, you have a more dispersed pocket of heat or flat, not really heating up in the north. So we started from here. So we have this data that from now on I would call it as the dependent variable of the study, which was the surface temperature, average surface temperature in summer. On top of that, we have a lot of course, socio-demographic data. At the scale of neighborhoods, that here is 2,400 neighborhoods, if I'm not mistaken, something as such. The exact number, I don't know. So in that, we can also take a look at different demographic statistics. For instance, what here is shown is the percentage of women minus men that I use it for as an indicator of gender imbalance. The darker blue shows women outnumber men, and whereas lighter it's become is other way around. So it's men outnumber women, and variation is bigger than expected. So you can really expect something like 3% up and down, where sometimes it's really large in extreme cases. And well, from now on, we call this one independent variable. So we also have so far the surface temperature of the whole country at a scale of 1 kilometer per 1 kilometer. And at a neighborhood scale, which are quite fine grained, we have the gender balance. This can be supported, of course, the gender, well, the demography is a multidimensional phenomena. So to complete on that, we also had a series of control variables. The immigration status of the residents. We have a Western immigrants that mainly from EU, US, UK, Australia, and Japan. That's a Dutch definition of Western. All non-Western immigrants are the rest. Also, there's a big percentage of rental dwellings across Netherlands that was also taken into consideration. In each neighborhood, we know the median building age to know how old or new is the neighborhood. There are also 3 age groups are included. The population older than 65 years old, population 15 to 24. Given that 15 years old is a working age in Netherlands, from 15 one can work, and population younger than that. Particularly also because the young and old population are the most vulnerable to heat. We also included income per capita and property value. And so these are the things that I would call control variable from now on. And we started to just develop 3 models. The very first statistical model was a simple model It uses land surface temperature as an output, as a dependent variable, and gender imbalance as a independent variable, or variable which explains the differences. And the result was quite interesting. The gender imbalance of the neighborhood alone explains almost 10% of variation in land surface temperature. And for one single variable, that's really significant. Also, it's very significantly shows that more are the women in a neighborhood in the Netherlands, wherever it is. Now there's no special variation yet in this model. More are the women, more the temperature. And for 1% more women, you would get 0.1% temperature higher temperature. And well, that significant starting point was the basis to develop two other statistical models. The second model used gender imbalance, but also in addition, it used all these control variables, include all the control variables, and also include the interactions between control variable and gender groups. So we have the women minus men, but we have Western immigrant, non-Western immigrant, so on and so forth. And then there's on top of that, there are variables for the interaction terms of the gender balance and Western immigrants, gender balance and non-Western immigrants, gender balance and rental dwellings, so on and so forth. That's the second model. It's a simple OLS model, but it doesn't have a special weight. So the assumption of this model is that there are relationships which fit to every location of the Netherlands. The third model is similar to the second model, but it has a special variation. It includes a special weight matrix around each neighborhood. As you can see on the bottom left, I hope you also see the animation in it. So for each neighborhood, you look at the neighborhood itself and its surrounding. And the basic assumption of this model is that the inequality is different in different contexts. So it means that, as for instance, we saw in the first model, we just take a look at the overall inequality of gender groups, exposure of gender groups. This model doesn't assume that there's an overall one-size-fits-all answer, but it will search neighborhood by neighborhood to see in that context who's the most vulnerable. The result of these two models, the model 2 and model 3, first of all, they are very robust. Second model can explain 54% of the variations, which is really a strong model, and the third model up to 75%. So the very first conclusion here is that there's a very significant association between surface temperature and the social pattern. It's up to 75%. So they almost reflect one another, and that was the first result. Secondly, given that the second model, the third model outperformed the second model, the other result here is that this vulnerability, environmental justice, is location specific. Environmental justice is a phenomena with a spatial variation, and it's not a one-size-fits-all phenomena. And this is what also is, well, it can be learned from here. Therefore, from now on, the model 3, the model with the spatial variation, is the basis of what I show. The model just start to, it can estimate the overexposure of men, overexposure of women, or the areas that there's no significant gender inequality observed. It also, on the left side, shows that when it's only about gender, so there's no other socioeconomic characteristics is involved, or what we assume there's a latent variable. And the ones, the right ones, the other 4 maps, they show that the ones that there's a there is gender and a particular socioeconomic characteristics together, how they work. Also, there were some factors that they really didn't show a big gender inequality, and therefore it's not included here. So from now on, that's what we can know from a statistical model. From now on,
excuse me to interrupt. You've got 5 minutes left. So
sure. Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's so far what we could know from the statistical model. So from now on, it's just start to interpret or to discuss the results. And I also know I should go quickly. So starting to just map all these different factors. For instance, in 54% of the areas, women are overexposed, whereas in 0% of the areas that's been seen for the men. The same goes, for instance, 51% for the women in the low property value. And it goes down for 41% women and high building age, 25% women, higher income women, and also you start to see the patterns of also men are overexposed, so on and so forth. Starting with first one, with gender per se, without any socioeconomic characteristics involved. The explanation that it could come, the assumption we can assume, is that a very different distribution of men and women across the different areas of the Netherlands. In the areas which are urbanized, these are definitions, Dutch definitions, to very highly urbanized or moderately urbanized, women outnumber men. Whereas when it goes to the more rural or unurbanized area, men outnumber women, and that's a very significant pattern, which is perhaps that's the core behind these observations. And one assumption about that could be the different position of men and women in a labor market in the Netherlands. 25% of men are working on industries, in an industry sector, which is more on a non-urbanized areas, and up to 3% of them to agriculture, and this is significantly outnumber women. Whereas women are mainly in the service sector, and that could be the first assumption to explain why they are very differently distributed in urbanized and non-urbanized areas. That also you can find it in theory. For instance, perhaps you know the book of Hannah Rossin that about that 12 out of 15 growing occupations in 21st century, mainly in service sector, would be more women, dominated by women. Also, IMF has this has projections that in Europe, substantial portion of women would work in a service sector. The same has been seen also at the regional scale, and also on a digital economy, that women start to grow or outnumber men in jobs in that sector. And these are sectors that we assume more is correlated with living in urban areas. Also, there are patterns about women of the higher income to be more exposed, whereas women with the lower property value be more exposed. So that this seems a bit contradicting. And also women living in a high with the older buildings. If you take a look first one to the women with a higher income, the pattern is more in areas which there's a high mix of urbanized and rural areas. And presumably, this is related to the phenomena that is called and studied in Netherlands, also in other cities, suburbanization of poverty. In Netherlands, there's a significant pattern that low and middle income households are moving out of the main cities. And also the income gap between rural fringe areas and the core city is getting bigger and bigger. So the assumption here is that that's another reason, that the women who are also having a higher income are more likely to be overexposed to the surface temperature. Also, when it comes,
we are coming to the end of your 20 minutes. Can you?
I wrap 1 minute, maybe.
Okay.
Yes,
yep.
okay. So
we want to get the essence.
Sure. And the very last one would be about the property value and the high building age. Well, we know a higher property value is very much correlated with access to green spaces, so that might be explanation. And also older buildings compared to the post-war buildings have less of the green areas. And altogether, women also the elderly women, which are more likely to live in the urban areas, they are more likely to be living alone because of higher life expectancy and more likely to stay in the urban areas. The conclusions is very much has been said. And with that, I just give the floor back to you.
Thank you very much. That's amazingly interesting. Not seen anything like it before. So thank you. Are there any points of clarification now? Anybody want to ask a quick question, or we can move on to the general discussion? Okay, well, maybe John, you should ask your question of Bardi, or your comments, please.
Thanks, Helen, and Bardi, thanks for the presentation. I don't know if you've had a chance in the chat just to read the question, but maybe if I just embellish it slightly. I think it's really important. I think one of the things within the regional studies community, there's been a strong focus on kind of gendered impacts of regional development policies and various regional processes that affect regional development. So I think the work that you're doing and the presentation was fascinating in that regard. I guess one of the challenges for researchers and when you present such rich findings is how we then think beyond kind of the scientific community and presenting the almost what your research has found. What do you think are the potential implications? Is there a policy aspect to this? Is there a broader societal aspect where we think about how we take these findings and maybe engage policymakers and practitioners? So to try and boil that down into a simple question, if you presented this research to policymakers in the Netherlands, what would your key message be? What do you want them to do, if anything?
Yes, well, that's a very good question. I guess that would be more of a collective effort, because the first question comes is to which policymaker and what scale. In Netherlands, we have, of course, the regional authorities, but also there's a more governmental authority on health that they might be very interested in in this dimension. We have colleagues who are working in a environmental law significantly on that. That is, what are the rights of people for the access to the environmental well-being, as Robert would call it. So the answer to your question is that's an open way to go. It's very, very hard to say. Still in Netherlands, we are stuck with the proper definition of energy poverty. So environmental poverty perhaps is the next step to go through. I would say the very first would be, who is the policymaker to approach? Also to develop on the idea of justice, because now it's all about the equality. I measure the equality of exposure to the heat, but and then we see, okay, there's a spatial variation, but I assume there's a socioeconomic variation too. There are people of different age or different situations are more vulnerable perhaps, and so that must be a more overall definition. And after that, find the correct policymaker and approach. So that would be my answer.
Thanks. And Helen, just say, I've got to go and teach in about 30 seconds. So if Robert wants to answer the question that I put in the chat earlier for him, by all means, go for it. But apologies, I will have to jump offline now.
Oh, okay, well, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your great questions. Okay, bye-bye. Okay.
Thanks. Should I answer the question?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I guess he's just left, so I won't cover the answer that he sees there. But yeah, thanks to John for his question. The question in the chat talks about the relationship between well-being, resilience in the context of regional development, and I guess reflecting on that, I guess it just shows maybe some of the complexities that comes back to maybe understanding these concepts, particularly as they might be seen to be quite subjective in many ways. Well-being particularly, the well-being sort of does refer to in its definitions more about sort of general standards of living and quality of life in that respect. Whereas resilience maybe then relates to sort of how quickly you can respond in relation to maybe a crisis or difficult times. And that's why I guess the research is framed in the case of COVID, because we are responding to a fundamental crisis in this case. I think the relationship between well-being and resilience in this case is quite interesting because, as he refers to in the questions, the director interviews talks about well-being maybe as a foundation for resilience. I think that stems from the nature of the region itself as a mix of sort of old industrial and also very rural area combines together, in which maybe not necessarily a natural region because it's come together as a city region. You've got many challenges in that respect then. So the focus initially on well-being maybe from the directors is that they're trying to develop a better quality of living and better living standards across the region as a whole, because it has its own challenges in normal times. But then the idea of that as a foundation then for resilience is a sense that maybe you need to first of all address a number of existing issues before you can maybe tackle the issues of resilience then in response to the times of economic difficulty like we've seen with COVID-19. So I think that's maybe that's how the relationship could be seen there, in that there are a number of underlying issues as it is, and therefore maybe that brings its own challenges towards seeing how a region can be resilient as well.
Thank you. A question to both of you. Both of you talked about equality, but there are other groups, and both Bardi and you picked up on this heterogeneity of populations. So there are these different age groups, but there's also different ethnicities and disabilities that are all part of this debate. And there are obviously priorities. Gender is a more obvious one, but where the Welsh government and what happens in the Netherlands, picking up on those nuances. And I know that even within South Wales, when I did research the Regional Studies Project, people had moved from Cardiff to Swansea because it was more ethnically diverse and they felt more at home and there were more opportunities. So even within South Wales, you're getting these differences. So whether you could both reflect on those, that heterogeneity when you're doing this analysis.
Mm-hmm. Should I go first? I mean, you just mentioned Swansea then, so I'm happy to jump in first then, sorry. Yeah, I think in the case of South West Wales, that's quite interesting. And Swansea as the urban area is relatively diverse. But then once you get outside of Swansea and you go into the rural areas, the levels of diversity really drop significantly. And it's difficult to find very diverse societies then in relation to that. So I guess that shows the contrast that you see within the whole region that it's classified there. And that's where maybe I'd bring some question marks into city regions policies in that respect, because it's not necessarily a coherent region and a region where you can manage many of the different aspects of society in a very effective way, because you've got many different parts of the region and different areas and different challenges to overcome in that respect.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'll say Netherlands, there's a big ethnicity also has a big role. But because also ethnic groups are distributed very differently across the country, two groups should be differentiated. The Western immigrants are mainly, they are coming after enlargement of EU, and they come to Netherlands to work, a lot of them, on construction sector, agriculture sector, and industry. So that has a particular pattern. Most of the people who come are male, so that also you get this pattern of the immigrants you get also has a gender pattern itself. But non-Western immigrants, there's a totally different situation. They moved typically in 70s, and they got home mainly in the city centers and in the areas that even back then was not a good area. So they are very much exposed to the type of air pollution, surface temperature, and this type of hazards. Whereas the Western immigrants might live in areas that, for instance, has a more chance for flooding or the type of air pollution from industries or something like that. I just want to say that the perspective that we look at the gender, but this is not really like this. So this is one way of looking at that, but whereas they are all very interconnected system with the diversity, with a very heterogeneous spatial heterogeneity. So if you look at it from an ethnic perspective, also you will get a very significant patterns of inequality, and so that's also the case in the Netherlands.
Yeah. So more scope for analysis then.
Sorry?
More scope for analysis.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
More work to be done.
More work to be done.
Okay.
Also, more different type of environmental hazards. Also, it was in Robert's presentation that there are many factors to take a look. It's hard to decide sometimes which one is, because it comes to the trade-offs. If you want to have, you want to escape air pollution, for instance, you might be more exposed to the flooding risk, and that's also very hard when it comes to multivariable approaches like Robert does, and that really shows the complexity of the issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Sally, you have a question?
Hi, thanks, Helen. Yeah, it's a question to Bardi. I was just interested in the extent to which you think the results, the empirical results that you found in the Netherlands would be a pattern that you would see in other parts of Europe.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, that's what I'm doing now. I'm very curious to know how it applies to the different regions in Europe. If you take a look to Netherlands, I think Netherlands is 2 or 3 knots to region, whereas Europe has something more than 300 of them. And I'm very curious how it works on the different areas. That's what I'm busy with. So that's yes.
Thank you. And Robert, while we're on these issue of measurements, then what's the main challenges of implementing wellbeing measures in this case study? How did you go about it? What were the real problems?
Well, that is the big challenge, I think, in relation to some of the aspects. Like, for example, when I put the slide about the 39 different measures that are being looked at in Iceland, for example, many of those are quite subjective aspects. And I was talking to some economists about this recently, and they were sort of like, well, we can't measure that; it's too difficult. So it's maybe something which needs to be thought about. How can we look at ways in which we can sort of see whether the wellbeing aspects are being applied in an effective way? But I think what we're seeing in relation to the principles from the Wellbeing in Future Generations Act in Wales, for example, is it's a bit more simplified. There are only 7 principles there, whereas obviously for New Zealand and Iceland, there are a number of other drivers there or other measures that are represented. So I guess by keeping it simple and by making sure that these are sort of principles which could be used to influence policy making or decision making, in the sense that you need to make decisions that have global responsibility. So you shouldn't make a decision that doesn't do anything that's particularly harmful to the environment, or does anything that has a negative impact on climate change, or that you should make decisions that do represent cohesive communities. So by maybe taking those principles and influencing decision making, they can be used as principles then, and it doesn't necessarily need to be a specific set of measures in that respect, but it's just a way of making better decisions by thinking about the principles of well-being and how the decisions that you make can be best suited towards meeting those principles.
Thank you. Sally, is this a comment you're picking up on?
Yeah, I just popped a little comment on there. When I looked at the it wasn't the New Zealand, it was the characteristics for well-being before that. What I would have quite liked to have seen is maybe different size fonts being used to indicate the impact and importance of some of those characteristics for citizens. So for me, I'd have put job satisfaction in quite big letters, because I spend an awful lot of my time at work. So having a rewarding, interesting job is really important to me. But of course, if you look at the, is it Maslow's pyramid of needs, you know, I'm in a relatively privileged position where that's one of my main concerns. But I would have been quite interesting to have seen that weighted.
Well, that's interesting again as well, I guess, because people would weight those in very different ways, because obviously people's priorities are very different. So again, that really shows the subjectivity of it. And I guess that is a challenge going forward when it comes to research in this area, is knowing more about how we can maybe develop a more specific framework for this, or find specific ways in which, you know, we can identify criteria that can help us to measure this, you know, not necessarily in a quantitative way, because it's very qualitative in its essence, but, you know, how we can sort of, you know, understand this and see how it's being effective.
I can see that you would get very different results from a young urban cohort to an older peripheral rural region where the needs are so different. But it would be interesting, and it would help policy, I think, because they would know what are the interventions that they're going to make that would have the most impact on citizens' lives.
Mm-hmm. I think so, and I think that's maybe a sign of why so few places have adopted maybe well-being as a principle that's sort of impact on decision making. Because as I said, you know, in terms of the literature, it's not something which is new. There's been discussions about well-being from economists, you know, for over a decade now.
Yes.
So, you know, yeah, where's, you know, why haven't we seen this be more widespread? Maybe because it's very difficult to maybe apply in practice.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentations.
Thanks.
Yeah, so picking up on that point, because Wales is so different, you've got a very sensible leader as opposed to other parts of the UK. I mean, it's got
That's quite subjective in itself. Some people would disagree with you.
Yes, but
yeah.
There are different perspectives on how Wales operates. But when you talk to different agencies, and in your CV, you've given these presentations, what do they want to know from you? Do they want to know the methodology, or do they want to know what you found out? What are their priorities?
Well, I guess it depends really. From a Welsh perspective, there are many challenges. You know, it might be considered that there's good leadership in some ways, but there's also very you know, difficult challenges of you know, deprived areas, very significantly deprived areas. So when it comes to regional development and those aspects, then I guess people are a bit skeptical in terms of looking at new ideas, because they think, oh, we've seen it all before. Somebody's come across with a new idea, we've tried it, it hasn't really worked. I mean, there's been decades of investment in particular areas in Wales, particularly in the South Wales Valleys area, obviously the post-industrial area in Wales. There's been a lot of funding from the European Union, which has obviously stopped now. So I guess we need to look at different approaches from that respect. So I guess people are a bit skeptical when it comes to things like this, but I think we do need fresher ideas, in the sense that we need the people closer to the ground and more place-based ideas being developed. And I think people are more keen to be part of that. And so the approach that For the Region is taking in terms of engaging with a wide range of community stakeholders makes people feel more like they're actually, you know, involved in the process of trying to improve the situation in their regions and in their particular areas, rather than have somebody coming in with a great idea or bringing lots of money in and spending it in certain ways and them not necessarily seeing the results. So I think, yeah, having that place-based approach, that inclusive approach, the approach in which people are involved, they can start to feel as if they're making a difference in their local area then. And that's something which is positive to come out from the work.
Thank you. And Bardi, can we pick up with you on that point?
If I just want to add on that, to add a perspective to that, I think what is really important to take a look is that what happened after COVID, I believe, are the geographic dependency between the place that we work and the place that we live has become much weaker. So we as employees and also our employers, we all learn that it's not really necessary to be there. And then the effect is start to become visible in Netherlands. For instance, many people who lived in the big cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and then they have an expensive house to sell. They start to move to more areas which are more natural, less urban or something like that. So all the things that we do now very much is that based on the fact that this population gonna be here and we have to change the situation for them. It's also my research is like that. So they are there and they will do. It would be interesting to take a look at how they're gonna start to move. It's like that this being healthy or being environmentally comfortable or all of these things may move the population easier. And that's a question for future and for the policies. We should take it into consideration that the demography of the area that we are talking about may more easily change. And that's something to, I think that would be a dimension that is not part of our analysis now, and something to think about.
Thank you. You're both academics working in universities. In the Netherlands, our universities seem to be key stakeholders in this, in bringing about change and dealing with issues of resilience. Or are you still separate from?
Well, we conduct a lot of research. There's a new approach, this impact plan approach. Nowadays, whatever grant we write about, it should have a very clear impact plan and be related to policy. Sometimes up to 20% should be an in-kind contribution. So I cannot compare it to the UK situation. I don't have a knowledge, but I say here, yes, universities are very involved. So this research we do, is at least it will be seen by the policymakers.
And you're going to reach out to other groups and publicize it.
Yeah, and also they are, most of the time they are in our consortium. So yes, so they are involved.
Well, that is good news, because it's great research and deserves to be taken up by people who are making the decisions. And as you say, there are so many different people out there, and it's who's going to listen and who's going to use it most effectively.
This part of it is nice, but also there's a sad part to it. To fair is necessary to say, when it comes to the top-down policies, as far as ideologically, I don't like it, but the policymakers speak it. But there are not very good experience for the other side. There are experiences, for instance, to take the cars out of neighborhood and make it more green and more clean or something like that. And then whenever, in a lot of cases, when the residents are involved, they don't like it. They don't like it in an ideological level, but they don't like the fact that they cannot have a car parking, for instance, in front of their house. So it's a lot of times it comes from top, and then it's blocked on the other way. There's a very big resistance against, for instance, agricultural policies. That's one of the biggest pollution-making sectors, and also there are some even right-wing parties which are waving at that issue. So we are heard as scientists, but I don't know where it goes. So that's a short answer.
That's a very interesting point, isn't it? Where does it go? So is there I'll ask both of you, is there anything you would like to say in conclusion, Bardi, or as you're with us now? Is there anything else you want to?
Well, I just want to say, as also comes a very good question, how it should be related to policy. I would say it's an interdisciplinary joint collaboration between urban geographers, between policy scientists, between environmental law, so even from medicine or something. So from my own side, I want to say I'm very open, and I look forward. We cannot do it alone, so we need to have an interdisciplinary perspective.
That's great. Thank you very much, Robert.
Well, yeah, I think that's a very good point as well, actually. And I think, we work in very interdisciplinary fields, really, in a lot of the work that involves regions and the work of regional studies as well. So bringing different perspectives is very important. And like I mentioned, and like Bardi mentioned as well, neither of us are economists necessarily, but there's a lot of economic aspects that do come into our work here. So engaging with people across a range of different backgrounds is really important. And I'm always open to speaking to people who has perspectives in relation to this, so we can sort of help to form better ideas around the concept of well-being that we're looking at here. And well, this is part of some extended research that we're looking to do with some of my colleagues. We're looking to expand this to look at what's happening in Sweden with some partners there, and also with some partners at Georgia Tech in the USA to see different perspectives on this. So I think it's important to expand that and keep asking questions on a wider perspective.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you both speakers. That really excellent presentations, very, very enjoyable. So thank you. And thank you for the attendees as well. It's been great, really interesting questions, and it's a lovely session. So thank you. Just to say, the recording can soon be viewed on the RSA Hub. There are events continuing, more parallel sessions, including a number of special sessions from our festival partners. Further highlights is an OECD plenary tomorrow, Wednesday, the 30th March. And you can view all the sessions on the RSA Hub, the mobile app or the desktop version. So I'd like to just finish by thanking everybody again and thanking the Regional Studies Association for putting on these events. So thank you. Is there anything else you want to say, Sally? Or
yeah, I'd like to jump in and thank you, Helen, for doing a great job as chair yet again for us. So thank you very much. It's been really great.
Thank you. Okay, well, thanks very much. So goodbye, everybody. Thank you.